we've talked about these different things that you can do if you want to actually do something about the climate crisis. The go-to thing you might have thought before this class would have been like personal lifestyle changes. So it's not just that one or two people are talking, it's like a lot of people are talking. So lifestyle changes, sure, you can do that. In fact, I'm even going to talk about that as an intersectional issue today, but also climate activism, becoming involved in a group. We keep talking about why that's important, becoming politically active, i.e. vote. But here is yet another thing you can do, number 4 on our list, which is to communicate. And the reading we have for this week is by Richard Somerville's Communicating Climate Change Science. People are still talking. And you know, I keep getting emails from other people in the class telling me how difficult it is just to hear what I'm saying through these big loudspeakers when other people are talking. And people just keep doing it. I mean, I don't know what to do. We could have the TAs go around and ask you to leave and lose credit for the week. I hope it doesn't come to that. Anyhow, Somerville is in this great book, Bending the Curve, which is available free online. You just have to read the one chapter. It's all available. It comes from the UC Press, so it's University of California, and we have some UC faculty contributed to it, people like David Pello from the Environmental Studies Department. So let's do our first iClicker poll. So have you ever tried to communicate the severity and or the importance of the climate crisis to someone? And I'm not asking if you were successful or not, but just have you ever, made an effort to do so? Definitely, sort of made an effort, not at all, or maybe not sure. So let's see. Most people have in one way or another. Made the effort. Small minority haven't, which is fine. I just wanted to kind of get since we are talking about the importance of communicating the climate crisis, how many people have actually made that effort? And we'll kind of revisit this with the other iClicker polls. So, as the overview to this chapter notes, you meet a fictional character here called Uncle Pete, if you haven't read it already. Uncle Pete is this person that you may know, maybe a member of the family, like if you go home for Thanksgiving or something, there's this Uncle Pete who doesn't really believe in the climate crisis, doesn't believe it's as severe as possible. And the person who made this chapter, Somerville, is guessing an Uncle Pete who strongly resembles someone like this. And what this chapter is about then is to prepare you for having your next meeting with Uncle Pete and similar skeptics you may find. So what's the chapter about? It's preparing you with the basics that you would need if you wanted to have a conversation to try to sway someone who's not quite sure about the climate crisis. But I'll say, just at the beginning here, if you encounter a real hardcore climate change denier, this is probably not going to work. But many people are more in the skeptic range, not quite sure, and that's what Somerville is preparing us for. The challenge then takes on this formidable, the article takes on this formidable challenge of communicating the reality of the climate crisis to skeptics. So I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but something I think that Somerville neglected by taking that very sort of focused approach to dealing with skeptics, and that is, this related thing of how you would try to convince people that you know who are not skeptics, perhaps your friends. So Somerville talked about what to do for skeptics. I'm going to talk about people you know already, people you know who know that the climate crisis is real, but just don't really act on that, or sort of ignoring it, or kind of in that category. So I'm going to talk about those strategies today, and we'll touch on Somerville too when we get to the comments. And the reason is, if you're like me, many of your friends are already convinced the reality of the climate crisis. Pretty much everyone in the room here, many people you're going to encounter, students at UCSB are, because we tend to surround ourselves with people who are like-minded in a range of different ways. It might be then that if you know people who already believe that the climate crisis is real, that what they want to know is what can be done about it, or if anything can be done. There are many defeatists out there who are of the mind that, end game is here, we can't do anything, we should just live our lives and let it play out. But I think many people really do want to know what they can do about it. And for most people, it usually comes down to personal action, that thing like skipping meat or something. And that's fine. But there are a lot of things that can be done. And then the question is, how do you communicate these different things? Um, so the things that Somerville underscores here, things like preparation, stories, metaphors, language, can help you communicate to your friends. But then the question becomes, how do you open up a space for communication? How do you broach the subject and get it going? What's what is a strategy that you could employ? I would argue, and I realize it sounds paradoxical, that the best thing is not to initiate talking about the climate crisis. If you want to convince people, don't bring up the subject. I know that sounds paradoxical, let alone initiate it by talking about your own personal actions. And I quote here from a great book on mindfulness meditation by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who suggests the same regarding meditation. And he says, quote, "Every time you get a strong impulse to talk about meditation and how wonderful it is, how hard it is, or what it's doing for you these days, and what it's not, or if you want to convince someone how wonderful it would be for them, just look at it as more thinking and go meditate some more. The impulse will pass and everyone will be better off, especially you." I think that's right. But then it is a paradox. And if you're not going to bring it up to people, because as with anything like meditation, if you're super enthusiastic about it, people might get turned off for it. Then the question is, how do you communicate it? And you know this as a problem, right? Maybe you don't know it from your actions, but maybe with actions of your friends who become really enthusiastic about something, and then immediately begin to, talk our ears off about, how wonderful it is. It's not a very successful way to spur people to action. So the question then is, how do you deal with this paradox? What's the best way to communicate? I wouldn't, in general, decide this for other people, but to leave it to your friends to tell you when they're ready to hear about it. So that's the difference here. It's kind of one of timing. If your friends are ready, then they will ask you about it, rather than you choosing the time, like when they're not, which will presumably be when they're not ready. So how would this work in practice? I'll give an example from my own life. I mentioned in class, because someone asked about it, so I figured I'd just continue with it. I was a pretty hardcore vegan for 5 years, and before that I was a vegetarian, before that a pescatarian, and before that I didn't eat a whole lot of animal products for decades. So whenever I was out to dinner with friends, this sometimes became obvious before I even ordered, as I would often, because if you eat an alternate diet, you pretty much have to ask servers what the situation is, like what additives are in it and all. People would then, just almost as a courtesy, ask about my eating habits, and if I said that I was a vegan, that pretty much shut down the conversation. I mean, full stop, shut it down. And why is that? And you may have this experience from either side of the situation. I would argue, from a point of view of communication, is because people know what a vegan is. There's no one in this room, no one you'll likely encounter, who doesn't know what a vegan is. There's no need to ask about it as a lifestyle. There's nothing further that needs to be asked. The problem is that when you announce that you're a vegan, many people assume that you do so because you have strong ethical convictions. And many people assume that, as a vegan, then you feel particularly virtuous and morally superior. They assume that that's what vegans think, that they're morally superior. It may not be the case. I mean, clearly. But I can tell you that it's often what people assume that you feel, and really they're assuming something even a little more. They're assuming not that you feel virtuous, but they're feeling they're imagining how you feel about them, that they are not virtuous, that they've made bad moral decisions, that this is a way of you virtue signaling, but in virtue signaling, you're shaming them in the process. So it doesn't sound like it would be that way, but just saying that one word, you're vegan, suddenly, people are assuming certain things about you and being made uncomfortable because of their own decisions. And that's why I say that if you want to communicate something here, announcing that you're vegan is pretty much going to shut down conversations. I say that not as a theory or not because I've read studies on it, but this is totally anecdotal through my own experiences. So, how then do you go about if you want to communicate something like the importance of diet with respect to the climate crisis? We saw a strategy for this already, right? Kip Anderson, who made the film Cowspiracy, that's his approach. He wanted to communicate it. But how would you do it if you wanted to communicate it? So here's my approach. It's not saying it's perfect, but it's generally been working for me, and it works better than when I announced I was a vegan. And by the way, I'll generalize this beyond food systems in a few minutes, but first. So when asked, and using my former example, like when I'm out to dinner with friends, I generally reply that while I indeed have been a pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan, and all that, I largely think of myself as a climatarian, which I do. And I admit to being intrigued by friends who are freegans and actually try to be as much a freegan as I possibly can. So, and this is true. So I'm not a vegetarian. I mean, I am largely pretty much vegetarian, but I really think that the maxim, the way that I think about how I eat is as a climatarian. So you can imagine what happens when I announce this and talk about climatarian and freegan. As you might imagine, people almost always ask, what is a climatarian and what is a freegan? So at that point, people, they're not sure what I'm talking about, so they actually want to learn something here. They're actually being asked to be informed about what a climatarian is. And again, they don't have to ask that about being a vegan, but climatarian and freegan initiates opens up a space for communication. And I say this again from experience, it does work. So, if you don't know already, I think I've mentioned it to this class, but I explained that a climatarian is a way of eating. Sounds similar to vegetarian, and it's a relatively new term. Flexitarian is a word that's out there, or eating flex more like simply. But it was coined, at least was entered into the dictionary just less than a decade ago in 2015. It denotes someone who eats with the climate in mind. So, for example, a climatarian would choose a turkey burger over a beef burger, as there are 2.5 times more greenhouse gas emissions producing a pound of beef than a pound of turkey. So it's the idea that it's not, something you do necessarily for animal rights or moral reasons or social justice reasons, because we consume so much more food than the rest of the planet, but it's something you're doing specifically for the planet. And I may have mentioned in other countries, they are really making this easier in that you can, when you buy food in Denmark, very soon in Denmark, there'll be a label that will tell you the emissions and the problems with the food that you're eating. And if you're a climatarian, you can literally sit in the aisle of your market and decide which of the two products you want based on their emissions. And of course, here's the problem, as I've noted a number of times, eating a pound of lentils is far better than eating a pound of beef, as the beef requires the release of 30 times more greenhouse gas emissions than lentils. The problem is, and this is an important point to communicate here, vegans require a certain kind of purity, and I can tell you it's really hard. I mean, when you go out to stores and all, and let alone the restaurants, trying to eat a vegan diet. But climatarians are not purists. It's not held to that kind of level. So climatarian is just meaning to make a decision based with climate in mind, and it may not turn out to be the best possible choice. So you try as much as possible to be aware of the climate impact of the food that you eat and to act on that knowledge the best you can, but realizing, and I would argue accepting the fact that you may not always be totally successful. It's just having that in mind. It's not always going to be possible, depending on where you're eating and all, but at least to think about that. And the end game is not to get emissions down to zero, like being a complete freegan, but at least to reduce emissions more. And again, a classic example would be beef. Just eliminate that from your diet and you're going to cut your greenhouse gas emissions in half. And as I mentioned before, that provisionally is enough at this point. I mean, the end game probably for the good of the planet would be if we ate largely plant-based diet, everyone across the population of the world. But on the other hand, right now, if we could just get beef out of the equation, it would be absolutely huge. But is it enough? You know, shouldn't we all be eating a largely plant-based diet and forgoing turkey, burgers, and beef, and eating lentil dals rather than having a beef or any kind of burger? But we're not talking about we're talking here about bringing greater awareness here, communication by starting people on a path. And I think in that sense, being a climatarian is the way of starting people on that path, to be at least aware, even if you're not doing a whole lot to act on it, but aware of how you eat affects the climate. And because becoming a vegan can entail radical lifestyle changes, and the notion of being vegan carries a great deal of cultural baggage, and let's be honest, much of it's negative in the eyes of the carnist, the meat-eating public, you risk being seen like an alien far offshore. It's just something too big a leap for people to make, and you wouldn't want to necessarily communicate that directly. Because you could start off by saying, even if you were vegan, you could well say that you're a climatarian. So I'm largely a vegetarian. I don't announce that. I announce that I'm a climatarian because that makes clear where my head is at. My head is about how this is an impact environmentally. So you could be, if you think about it, you could be anything on the spectrum of how you could eat and be a climatarian. I mean, I guess it would be kind of difficult if you're Atkins or paleo to say that you're a climatarian, but many other eating practices could be climatarian. And I would argue the climatarian can be seen as a bridge to the other shore. And I think it's a welcoming bridge because, again, if you're eating a conventional American diet, hearing something like veganism is just too big a gulf. Most people won't be able to get there. And it does potentially open up communication. I say this again anecdotally, but in hearing that I'm a climatarian, people often ask me at a restaurant or even just in generally, well, what difference does it actually make? Does it actually make a difference what kind of meat you eat? And yes, it's a huge difference. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, you have beef and lamb, the worst because of the way the stomachs work for those animals. And on the other hand, things like chicken and poultry more generally, and even pork isn't nearly as bad. So more than once, people have chosen more climate friendly options right there, and again, it could half their climate footprint. So I'm giving this as an example, not of virtue signaling on my part, but how you can communicate and develop a strategy for communicating to people. You may not like this idea, but yeah. Let me take the next iClicker poll, and I'm curious, if because many people in the class said that they were already trying to communicate, what your success was like in trying to communicate the importance or the severity of the climate crisis. Was it actually successful when you tried? And again, for a lot of people, given the last poll, you're going to answer E, you've never tried to communicate it. But if you have, how successful were you? That's the question. And the answer is perhaps a little successful or not very successful. Yeah, that's what I assumed, actually. And if you think about it, so even forget what Somerville says in that article or what I just said, nonetheless, the focus needs to be on how we can communicate this better, how all of us can communicate it. And again, this is just an incredibly important issue because, so many people or either, don't know about it, need to be disabused of their ideas. That's what Somerville is trying to get at, or want to do something, but they just don't know where to begin. Or if they do know, like the things that, like, how eating is a problem environmentally, they're just, put off by the notion that we need to have these major changes. So let me repeat Somerville's advice from the article. As researching in this case, through my example, the relative climate impact of foods is necessary here. And it's the sort of knowledge we need to acquire anyhow, right? So if you actually want to eat with the climate in mind, you need to have a basic understanding, which is easy enough to find out online now. So it's interesting, and I give it as an example of like how you can communicate, because it's a possibility you can actually convince someone to make a change right there. It would be great if telling people you're vegan could result in them swearing off of animal products. And there are examples, and people have used the example of food in the responses that we're going to see to Somerville, but it could completely backfire. Climatarianism, however, offers them a way to think about food choices. And for many people, thinking about the climate impact of their food choices is new. I think many people just don't think when they're sitting down to eat how this could be of an impact on the climate. And as we've seen through Cowspiracy and other materials, including lectures, it can have a huge impact. It doesn't present people, climatarianism, with and I'm using this as sort of an example of communication strategy more general, because it's not an either or choice of either animal products or not. You're not telling people to stop eating pizza with cheese on it, but then, hey, maybe, eat that pizza, but without 3 kinds of meat on it, and the difficulty here is, right, the bigger picture is, you're not going to convince more than 10% of Americans to go vegan voluntarily ever. There have been efforts to do that for the last 50 years when, environmental vegetarianism came on the scene 50 years ago, and looking at the actual numbers goes up and down a little, but it's always single percent, and often closer to 1 than 10%. So why then take this other strategy? Well, if you could get all Americans to just do something like eliminate beef and lamb, that would be huge. That would be much bigger than getting an extra 2 or 3% of Americans eating purely plant-based diet. And climatarianism could serve as a bridge to a fully plant-based diet. Who knows? So in other words, if you start thinking about doing this, and if you actually start employing something like climatarianism, it can slowly move you in the direction of moving away from one thing after another. So even if there's just one thing you change, which is eliminating beef, you may ultimately change more. So I also note that Freegan opens up the door to climate communication. I've talked about this a little before in passing, but I'll say it again. So in case this is an alien word to you, which it may well be. People certainly know vegan, but very few people know Freegan. It's another wonderful opportunity for communication, which I'm kind of taking right now as, eating Freegan is better than eating vegan. That could be a good bumper sticker. And the reason for that goes back to Project Drawdown. If you remember, when we looked at that list, eliminating food waste was at the top. Eating a largely plant-based diet was number 2. So largely plant-based, say fully plant-based, number 2, that would be vegan, but number 1 is Freegan. So I checked to see what Wikipedia says for Freegan. I didn't put it up there, but I'll read it off of here. Freeganism is often presented as synonymous with, quote, dumpster diving for discarded food, although Freegans are distinguished by their association with anti-consumerist and anti-capitalist ideology. And I think that's right. And in terms of what we've seen about being anti-consumerist and all, this comes together perfectly with Freeganism. And with being climatarian, it's pretty flexible to be a Freegan. you could be a freegan right now, today. That doesn't mean dumpster diving. So in an absolute sense, you'll find people who will go to stores and get food that's going to be thrown out because it's past its best buy or sell by dates. But that's not the only way to do it. So how could you be more freegan in your daily lives? So, when you go out to a restaurant, make sure you always bring any food that you haven't eaten home so that you can fully consume it. Zero waste for that meal. When you buy things and bring it into your house to eat, make sure that all that food gets eaten. So make sure that, things don't go bad in the refrigerator. Make sure you don't give yourself too large portions so that you don't eat them. That's all being freegan. And you could try to eat more of the food that you do have. So I mentioned something like beets. When people prepare them, don't just prepare the roots, prepare the leaves and eat them like chard or kale or something. It's not dumpster diving in the sense of what you might think of a freegan, but it is thinking with being a freegan in mind. So it's climatarian thinking, but it's involving thinking about food waste because, as we've seen, it's the number one environmental problem. So if you think in a freegan way, it's not, it's not an either or choice like being a vegan in a way that distinguishes freegan from vegan, and that vegan is totally hardcore, but freegan is just eat in a more freegan way. Or as someone once said, try to be a freegan. So yeah. Jump to the next one. Communicating through your actions is something interesting to think about. Because on the one hand, it once underscores that you really care about an issue. What I mean by that is, rather than giving lip service to it, if you actually believe in something enough to change your life, that underscores to people that you care about it. And also, if you've made the change and you have friends who are like you in many ways, they can probably make a change too, even if it's as simple as shifting from beef to turkey burgers, or making sure you eat as much of the food that you are given or take as you can. And it's also like being a climatarian, like a first step. The important thing about this communication strategy is that communication has been opened up, which is the idea behind this. That's spelled, something's wrong there. In practical terms, people are asking rather than you telling them something. And it's a crucial distinction, I think, because people are motivated by curiosity and more likely to become converted then. So if you think about it, then if you're interested in personal action, which I think is part of this equation, I would argue that collective activism is bigger. But if you are interested in that, which I think is good, this is a way of it not just being action, but as an act of communication itself. And it's not forcing it on anyone. It's not even announcing it or to anyone. It's not even opening up communication, but it is setting up for communication by getting people asking about it. So I'm curious, and we're going to get to the comments now, what you think about Somerville's advice and Uncle Pete and the climate crisis, as well as ways of communicating concerning friends strategy. So just to underscore again, this is an important issue, and I'll make it explicit with respect to the comments. But if you think about it, whatever you do, however good it may be, and that whether it's personal action, collective activism, or your vote, if you can effectively communicate to people around you, that will leverage that amazingly. So go to the example of a vote. Yeah, it's great if you vote. You should all vote. It's like super important. Oh, that reminds me, we have some comments from last time. I want to jump to them before I get to today's responses. Be great if you could vote, but it's also would be terrific if you could convince 2, 3, or 5 of your friends to vote. That suddenly multiplies it by 2, 3, or 5 times. So I wouldn't discount communication. It's something we don't always hear much about, but it is important, which is why basically we're spending the week on it. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the discussion, the comments you had. But first, people had a couple comments left over from last time. First comment, do you have any, kind of not quite clear from the wording, is there any chance of having Biden as the incumbent is meant as a way to get AOC in office through his resignation, since he's definitely too old to make it 4 years? Since she would be an even more controversial candidate. I'm not quite sure what to make of the comment, but yeah, that's not going to happen. Joe Biden is pretty clearly now going to be the Democratic candidate. AOC would be old enough to get into office. Clearly, she's not, she hasn't run for the Democratic ticket, and clearly she wouldn't be anywhere near the next person in line. Obviously, it would be Harris and all after that. It would be terrific, but it's not where we're going. Yeah. So the next comment was I recently watched a video on the politics of milk. It talked about Big Dairy and Got Milk ad campaign done by Milk Pep. According to the video, the industry has been targeting Gen Z with social media advertising. So I don't know this. Maybe it's true. Have you been targeted with social media advertising for milk? And the reason is because we, Gen Z, drink 20% less dairy milk than the national average. There have been a number of anti-milk campaigns run by organizations like PETA and the oat brand Oatly, which I would endorse. They reference the environment, hormones, and the health of cow's milk. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's an effective way of deterring people from drinking milk? So it's a really good question because that's what we're talking about this week, effective communication strategy. The way that I framed it, the way that Somerville has framed it, is talking to you individually. But what about corporations? What about collective activism? And that's what PETA would be, right? PETA is an activist group, what this person is saying, the strategy they've employed is to, quote, reference the environment, hormones, and the health of cow's milk. I think it is effective. I think people are not aware of the issue. And I would, by the way, extend this not to talk only about the problem with dairy milk from cows, but also things like almond milk and the problem with that. I mentioned that 15% of the water in California goes to producing almonds, which most of that goes to producing almond milk. We produce 99% of all almonds on the planet in California. I think that's still correct. And so it's a huge problem. And I mentioned that in our homes, we only use 4% of the water. So almost 4 times the water in California is being used for producing, almonds, than is actually being used by people for residential things. So I do think that making people aware of it, because I think people may not be aware of the problem. And a lot of times when we talk about cows, we talk about meat, and I keep talking about it, choosing a beef burger as opposed to a turkey burger. But let's not forget, cows are often also kept for milk. And in fact, California is not the largest producer of beef in the United States. I think that distinction goes to Texas, that sounds right. But California produces more dairy milk than any other state in the country, which is amazing given that, it takes an enormous amount of water to produce all that milk. So milk is also something that we have to think about. And fortunately, you don't have to get really kind of high tech like alternate meat products like, the Impossible Burger and things like that, let alone in vitro biofabricated meat, which is, actual meat grown in a factory. But they're alternative to cow's milk. So I think it's good that that was communicated, and clearly a brand like Oatly would advertise, because oat milk, along with hemp milk, environmentally are probably the 2 best milk alternatives that you can have, actual forms of milk. But you may know there's an effort, has been an effort, to not even allow those companies to advertise what they sell as milk. So if the Dairy Council succeeded at this, it would mean that the only thing in your grocer that could say milk on it would be dairy milk. If it said oat milk, or if it said it was made from oats or hemp or almonds, it couldn't even be called milk. So there's a big effort to do that. So another great question. And by the way, if you have questions, put them in. Do you think there's an inherent problem with Americans moving to other countries out of a desire to get somewhere where it feels like politicians listen to the public and care about their citizens and environment? Do you think that there is a risk of abandoning a sinking ship that comes from an increase in immigration, particularly because it's mostly made up of those with relatively more resources? Yeah, it's a really great question. It feels like I should put it to you. And you could say that there are any number of reasons why you might want to leave this country. Climate would be one. We're not acting on it. Environment would be another. Certainly, other countries are. I was just going to say more enlightened. Well, I'll say it with respect to like LGBTQ plus rights or BIPOC communities and things of that sort. You want to go to a country where people listen more to that. Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly think there's still a good bit of hope for this country, but it's going to come by fashioning it into the country we want it to be rather than abandoning a sinking ship, as this person says. So I think that's right. But it is tough to be an American when there are so many of these issues that Americans have that the rest of the world is working on that we're not quite. Okay, so this is our first comment. Talking to an Uncle Pete, I think, would be challenging because it's hard to control the anger I feel in their ignorance on something that is obviously happening. And this is it's a great observation. And I started with it because many, many people have made this comment that the idea of even talking to someone who's an out and out climate change denier is it just gets people's blood boiling. And it's a great comment because it is acknowledging sort of a personal shortcoming here, that the problem is not the way it's framed here with the person you're speaking with, but with you getting angry rather than finding fault with the person. So this way it's framed here, this person is finding fault with themselves for becoming angry. A person acknowledges that before any communication happen, they need to address their own shortcoming. In this case, it's anger. And I think it's a really great point. But the question is, and Somerville doesn't really take this up, but I'll say it in defense of Uncle Pete. I think anger towards Uncle Pete might be just misguided. So by Uncle Pete, I mean, any climate change denier or skeptic and all. So, because if you think about it, what does a climate change denier or skeptic, an Uncle Pete, actually have to stand? How are they going to profit by denying the climate crisis? Or they're not a climate denier if they're a climate delayer, delaying action on the climate crisis. If Uncle Pete is like most U.S. citizens, he is going to be impacted profoundly and negatively by the climate crisis. It might, threaten his community, his home, even his life. And I'm thinking of like the people in Paradise, California. So why in the world is Uncle Pete, advocating for and arguing for denying the climate crisis? Because, it could cost Uncle Pete a ton of money. It could cost most people a ton of money. It's, as we saw with Project Drawdown, not acting on the climate crisis now is just going to mean that it's going to be more expensive in the future. And I mean that both financially, but even if you move beyond it, the cost in human suffering is going to increase. So, and again, Paradise, California is a great example. So, it raises the question, why are these deniers like Uncle Pete, the people you may encounter, arguing for a position completely counter to their own interests? And I think that's the question to ask. Why in the world would anyone do that? The answer, and we've seen the answer to that already, is, they're very powerful groups, fossil fuel industry, its affiliates, beef industry, that profit every day by delaying action on the climate crisis. And what have they done as part of their strategy to continuing making profit? They've targeted people like Uncle Pete. Why? Because they want to turn these Uncle Petes, the deniers, the people you may meet, into advocating for their true cause, which may be obscured to Uncle Pete, but it's there. And the true cause of the fossil fuel industry, as we've seen, is to continuing making money for themselves, not for Uncle Pete. Uncle Pete isn't going to get any of that money that Exxon makes. But if they can turn Uncle Pete into an advocate who will go around, at Thanksgiving dinners everywhere and advocate for the, climate change denial, that's going to work well for them. And again, Uncle Pete's not gaining anything. He's not sharing in those profits. He's really a victim too. He's been victimized by the fossil fuel industry. It may be difficult to see it that way. And again, going back to the comment, you're sitting across the table from someone and you get really mad because they keep just, going on and on with this position. But that anger, I would argue, is misplaced. I don't say that anger is wrong. Anger can be kind of good to get you fired up about an issue like this, but to blame the person you're sitting across from and not the fossil fuel industry or any of the other industries that are benefiting by the harm that's being done to the planet, people across the planet, human beings, and all other sorts of beings across the planet is just wrong. The anger should not be against someone being duped by the fossil fuel industry, but the people who duped him. We might be kind of angry at Uncle Pete for being foolish enough to let himself be duped into advocating and fighting for the fossil fuel industry that's going to harm him, that what he's doing is harming him and his family and his community personally, and it's so someone else can profit from it. But I would even argue that that's misplaced because we've seen already, and I'm going back to that book we read, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, produced by the Heartland Institute. And what I mean by that is basically produced by the fossil fuel industry. We saw how really effective that was at communicating at raising doubt for people like Uncle Pete. So you can get kind of mad for Uncle Pete being duped by this industry, but this industry is really putting a lot of money and a lot of effort into duping people. So I find it hard to get really angry at folks like that. I mean, you can feel sorry for them, but anger is a good emotion here, I would say, as far as anger can be, but it's just misdirected. And I think what really we need, and I think this could be really hard when you're sitting across from an Uncle Pete, but is to be sympathetic to that individual, realizing what's done. And the goal here is not to, attack Uncle Pete, certainly not physically, even with words, but try to help that person understand the real situation that's obscured to them. And I know that's easier said than done, but if you want to do something about the climate crisis when you encounter an individual like that, working out a multi-pronged communication strategy, I think, is absolutely essential. And to do that is not to be, sort of taken over by your anger, which isn't really effective. And, it's, of course, to say what I've said before regarding this topic of communication, this is more important than anything that you can do individually, like switching to your diet or something. Because again, if you can use communication to convince, 3 or 4 people that let alone someone like Uncle Pete, I think has huge benefits. Next comment. I think the most striking point this reading made was comparing climate scientists to physicians or doctors. I've never thought of making this comparison before reading this, and it really stuck with me. It's true that people do not question doctors in the same way that they question climate change, and this can be due to political influence or sheer ignorance. Yeah, so this is another perfect example of a communication strategy, one that Somerville was actually employing in the article itself. In other words, the key to this approach is to not talk about the issue itself, but an analogous issue. And how can that analogous issue serve as a metaphor for the real issue? And we rarely take up issues with an open mind. You have preconceived notions. So like with a physician, the preconceived notion here is that we should believe a physician, right? From a very young age, you're taught that when you're really, really sick, the most important thing would find a really reliable physician. And it's absolutely a good thing. I mean, that forms the basis between, of trust between a physician and a patient and any really healthcare professional. And that trust is extraordinary when you think about it, because in that situation, we are really handing our lives to the physician. And if the physician says, take these pills, you may know very little about it. You take them, especially if you have, horrible fever or something, the antibiotic might be super welcome. The problem is that relationship we know very well, as Somerville argues, and that's why we act that way. If we're not well, we go to doctors to make us well. The problem is most people haven't encountered climate change scientists. And this then opens up this great opportunity, and we can see how it's been playing out for climate change deniers and the fossil fuel industry and others to paint a picture of climate scientists in a certain way. So you know about doctors firsthand. You probably never met a climate scientist. And if you're told that these people are corrupt, they're communists, they're unreliable, they don't know what they're talking about, their science and models are wrong, you're likely to at least think that might be true. Again, it's not, but people can buy into that image. And I think what's great about Somerville's article is it, rightly encourages us to make the comparison. If you care about the planet in the same way do you care about your body, and we absolutely should, both for the sake of the planet, all life on it, but ultimately for you and your body, if it's damaged, we need to call in experts to diagnose what's wrong and to offer up the cure. That's what we do with doctors, and that's what we should do with the planet as well. And we should trust them enough to act on the cure. After all, if you're diagnosed with a life-threatening infection, who would reject the course of antibiotics? I mean, once the diagnosis is there, we should look what the cure would be, and be grateful to them, really. And I say this not just in terms of computer models or new technology or something, but look at something like Project Drawdown, which we have. We should be grateful because that website and all the research that was aggregated to form it diagnoses the problem. It diagnoses, what the problem is, and gives us 100 things that we can do about it. Things that maybe were surprising to us, like, not wasting as much food, educating more people that have a uterus. That makes enormous amount of sense. But, it's great from Somerville to have come up with that metaphor, because it makes us realize where the missing link is. In other words, the problem is people understand what doctors do, care about that, and respect it and go to them, but we don't really know much about climate scientists. And that little breakdown there opens the door to someone. And, it's sad, because if climate scientists were thought of the same way as doctors, we would be deeply grateful for what they've done. They wouldn't be maligned in the way that they are, which we saw in the two Doubt films, Climate of Doubt and the other one, sorry, Emergence of Doubt. You wouldn't be, because we would realize they're doing something great. Yeah. Next comment. That was a very apt comment. One of the main problems with climate change is that big business like oil companies are much better at communicating an idea to the general public than scientists are. Yeah, this is a really good comment with respect to communication, because oil companies are some of, in fact, the wealthiest companies on the planet. And they can spend, and we know that they do spend, hundreds of millions of dollars to communicate disinformation on the climate crisis to the public. That's part of what they do. They have a huge budget to do it. They've been working it out for decades. They've looked at communication strategies from other industries like the tobacco industry. They've adopted them, and they're really good at it. And, the United States produces more oil than any other country on the planet, and we also consume more oil. What that means is, if you're under, and I've mentioned before, but if you're kind of curious why so much climate change denial literature is in English, that's why. It infects people across the planet, like in other English-speaking countries like England and New Zealand and Australia, where it's very big. But the epicenter for it is the United States because we have such a vested interest in the fossil fuel industry. And it raises a good question, what this person raises here, and that is, if the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates are spending so much money creating this disinformation, who's financing the dissemination of accurate information on the climate crisis? If hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent, what's the other side? Scientists and others. And the answer is no one is spending that. That's the problem. And that's been a problem since the climate crisis emerged in the public scene. So James Hansen, the climate scientist who first spoke to Congress in the 1980s, no one paid him to do that. Bill McKibben, who looks like he's going to become an English 24 again in a month or two, he wrote the first book on the climate crisis, incredibly popular book, The End of Nature, the following year, and no one paid him to do that. And if you look at all the people writing, incredibly influential writers, Naomi Klein, Elizabeth Kolbert, Bill McKibben, and all, no one's paying them to do that. They have to rely on book sales to do it. That's the only way that they make a living. And of course, no one paid Greta Thunberg to go out and do her school strike for climate. Climate scientists may be able to find some funding in form of grants to do their research, but no one, and this is a huge issue, no one prepares them and pays them to speak to the public. Climate scientists aren't trained in doing that, and they're not financed in doing that as well. It would be terrific if the US government stepped in to communicate the severity and urgency of the climate crisis to the general public. Of course, we could do it. I mean, a single B-2 bomber. I mention this because the military is so expensive, but that single airplane costs $2 billion to make each one of those planes. So we made one less plane, we could spend more money, the federal government could, than the entire fossil fuel industry in promoting action on the climate crisis, but we don't. And you know the answer why we don't, because having watched those Doubt films, you know that the fossil fuel industry has enormous influence at the federal level on our government, and I would argue state levels as well. And if you saw Cowspiracy, you know that they have that industry has enormous influence on the government. So it's not likely that politicians being financed in their reelection campaigns by those industries are going to give billions of dollars to get the right information out there. So it's the same answer again. What's the answer to this particular problem that this person raises? We need politicians to put people in office to, one, stop the denial literature, and two, to create counter literature. But until that happens, I think, the obligation falls on all of us. I mean, it would be terrific if we had national campaigns telling people that the climate crisis is real and what we need to do. But until then, I do think it falls on all of us. This person, this is a long comment. It goes into the next slide. I'll just read it. I agree with Ken that sometimes I feel that it's best to communicate without words and let people come to you. A couple of years ago, I became close with a friend I met at UCSB. She was vegan, but she did not advertise it in the way that I'd seen other people's advertise their veganism on social media. I became intrigued about her experience in eating a vegan diet and what led to those choices. After long, informative discussions and a couple of vegan turkey sandwiches, I made the decision to cut meat out of my diet. I've now been a vegetarian for 2 years without any pressure or persuasion. And then the next comment, next part of that, so it's the same long paragraph. When I moved in with a different friend last year, she eventually noticed I didn't eat meat and asked why. I explained my reasoning to her, and we would occasionally have casual conversations about the climate crisis. One day she came up to me and said, "I'm giving up beef for Lent." She hasn't eaten beef since. A few months later, she informed me that her brother stopped eating beef as well. In retrospect, I'm amazed by the power of this form of passive communication and the domino effect it can be had. There were quite a few people who made comments like this, that in their own communications with people, it made a difference. This is a long comment, but it has a second half, and I want to give you that because it it shows that as while there are great examples like this, it doesn't always end as well as this one. So let me continue. Person continues, my little domino train came to a screeching halt when I moved back home at the start of COVID. My family had constantly made fun of me for all my choices and opinions regarding climate change ever since I became a vegetarian. I have tried countless methods of communication with all of my family members, but they refuse to even consider anything I say. I have shown them the data and cited my sources and debunked the myths and presented the solution. By the way, this person is saying that they've done everything that Somerville has suggested. This is like a list of his strategy. I have explained the science and politics and industries behind everything. They just aren't interested in hearing what I have to say. This week's reading, Communicating the Climate Crisis, provides a lot of useful tools for communicating climate change. But I am not sure if there is any way of effectively communicating with someone that refuses to listen. I used to be passive about my feelings regarding climate change because my family would immediately knock them down. The struggle of communicating the climate crisis is real. Yeah. Is there, as this person perceptively notes, any way of communicating with someone that refuses to listen? So this is a great question. Somerville's article gives us these ideas, and his quote is that to have constructive and civil conversations about climate change with people who do not accept the fundamental findings of climate scientists. I think that's true, but I just want to underscore what this person wonderfully did, and that's the limit of that, right? Because there are a small minority of people in this country, and I want to underscore that they are a small minority. They're less than 10% of US population who strongly deny the climate crisis, either deny that it's happening, that it's real at all, deny that it's anthropogenic, being caused by human beings. They argue things like it's a natural cycle, just the same way we had glaciers tens of thousands of years ago. Now we happen to have a warm cycle. It's nothing to do with people. They argue that, yeah, it exists, but it's not as bad as we think. They argue that it's really everything that you've encountered, it's really an effort to try to make the United States into a socialist country or whatever. Those people are out there, and I think the fact is you will not be able to communicate to them. Full stop. I think it would be great if you could, but I don't think it's going to happen. But I would say we actually asked this question to Bill McKibben, who I just mentioned, and other people like Naomi Oreskes, who came to English 24 in May again. And when asked what to do about that, what to do if you encounter one of those hardcore people, if your Uncle Pete is someone you just can't get to, and both of them came up with the same answer. In fact, I said it, Bill McKibben said it first, and I mentioned to Naomi Oreskes that he said it, and she said, quickly responded, he got that from me. Either way, the answer that they both gave is a simple one, is don't waste your time. And I know that's frustrating after everything I just said about how important communication is, but there are some people to whom you're not going to be able to communicate. That's the bad news. The good news is they are a small minority of the US population, and they would be irrelevant if you can convince the people in the middle. And the middle group is the people that we need to convince. So it's not people that know about the problem already and acknowledge it. It's people that are a little confused and made confused by the fossil fuel industry. That idea of why both of the films we saw that week you had doubt in the title. That doubt has been cultivated by those industries, and your job, if you want to communicate to them, is to clear up the doubt, to make it clear that this is a real issue and has to be addressed. And that's fine, because if we can convince those people in the middle and bring them over to the side of climate action rather than climate inaction or delay, that's all we need. And if you look at like US politics, you should know that we are very much a split nation. I mean, things are so close. If you look at the elections, they are won by just a few million people either way, which given that we have, 300 plus million people, obviously not all of them voting, but hundreds of millions of people in the US, it wouldn't take much to go one way or another, which is, of course, why Donald Trump was able to deny the election, because if he could just prove a few million people want one way, his way, he would have stolen the election, which fortunately he wasn't able to do, fortunately for democracy's sake. Looks like there's some comments in the Q&A, so let me address them. Hey Ken, I watched Batman Ninja on Sunday, and Ninja Joker made a reference to climate change after cutting down the trees. Does the implementation of climate change references within media, whether it's TV, movies, etc., is it more harmful than good, or is it a good way to introduce people to the issue? Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think it's in part a function of how well it's done, and certainly there are whole series now that you may know of TV. I can't remember. I think it's called Extrapolations, which is on Apple, which is a series about the climate crisis happening. And of course, there are films. I mentioned, Don't Look Up, the latest Leonardo DiCaprio film. But is it good to have references in the media? I would think yes, as long as it was done carefully. But I think that would be the issue, and it actually is a great question, because it raises the question of communication, but yet in a whole different way. In other words, if you are in an industry that is communicating to people, how do you work it in there? And I would say that's, by the way, if you're like, an influencer, or aspire to be an influencer or something, it's not, how do you work it into a major, TV shows or movies, but how could you work it into, your own channel? And I think that's a really good question. Yeah. Someone asked the question, Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. I recently saw a video of his on TikTok that was titled "For Young People," who is RFK Jr. And it definitely seemed like he's trying to campaign to the younger generation. I also learned he's an environmental lawyer, which is good to hear, but I was curious to know your ideas on him. Yeah, I don't want to express too many of my own political positions, but you should know that RFK, for example, is a COVID vaccine denier, and he has been a vaccine denier for a long time, and that undermining of science is sort of something that he's done a great deal. So I think it's an issue, and he's also taken strong positions against things like, for example, because he's from, as is the whole sort of, Kennedy clan, like up in Massachusetts, like at Cape Cod and all. And when there was, and has been for decades, been an effort, people are talking again. There's been an effort to put in offshore windmills, because it would be a great area to supply that whole Boston area with electricity. He's fought hard against that because it would be an eyesore. So he's kind of an environmentalist in that cut. So I hope I've done enough to get you, if you have been influenced by these apparent ads, to look into RFK a little further. Yeah, so next comment. You made a comment about how we need to listen to scientists, like people need to listen to scientists like they do to doctors, but I felt like what we learned over COVID is how much that isn't the case. People refused to get vaccinated. They were trying to take other medicines despite doctors telling them they shouldn't. Doctors pleaded with people to social distance and wear masks. I feel like people won't listen to what they want to hear, no matter who it's coming from, doctors, scientists, teachers, etc. Yeah, no, that's kind of a sobering thought, but I think it's absolutely accurate. But again, I mean, there was a lot of disinformation coming out regarding COVID. A lot of it was coming from industry that wanted people to get back to work, was coming from a politician, a president who wanted people to get back to work. So But it is very unfortunate because the doctors that were behind, the COVID vaccines, which, I mean, when you think about it, the COVID vaccine was one of the most amazing things that humanity has ever done. I mean, we identified that we had this problem before it even spread worldwide. In a day, they had sequenced the DNA for it. In a day, they had figured out what the problem was. And then within like a month, they had actually created that RDNA vaccines, and they began testing on them. But I mean, that was an astonishing achievement. I mean, you don't remember, but when the DNA was first sequenced for human beings, it took over a decade to do and over $1 billion. We've now got that down where we can do it on a desktop level in 24 hours. And then we now have an entirely different type of vaccine that was able to be synthesized very quickly and entered human trials right away. That was absolutely remarkable. That was one of the great triumphs, I would argue, of science, certainly medical science. And yet there was this large effort of disinformation coming back. So it's a great question because this person is asking fundamentally about, disinformation. Yeah. And I think it keeps coming back to why communication is so important. Yeah. So another question, are there people in your immediate family also the same when it comes to my diet choices? So did you convince them, and how does that make you feel? About 7 years ago, my brother watched a cow documentary at school and made us watch it as well, and actually converted us to not eating beef anymore. But as time passed, the only person who still follows the diet is our mother and youngest sister. This is kind of like a personal question for me, but okay. So I was actually convinced to become vegan by my partner, and she was really on board for it. And it was very tough for her because she still likes to have meat occasionally. So even though she convinced me, but then when my daughter, who was 5 years old, she's 8 now, she decided that she wanted to become a vegetarian, or a vegetarian pescatarian then, and then a year later decided full vegetarian. And from that day onward, she never ate meat again. So yeah, there are people in my family, which makes it easier since my daughter and I eat the same exact way. Okay, let's get back to this. I still hear people talking. Even when I'm quiet, I can hear people talking. It's interesting. Okay, next comment. I thought this emphasis on giving people hope was really interesting, especially when he pointed out that would be Somerville, that people are not responsive to fear. I think that's good to keep in mind when we talk to our families, because if we want them to really listen to us, we cannot scare them or come on too strongly. First off, I would definitely triply underscore that. That's right. Scaring is not a technique at this point for the climate crisis that would be in any way effective. Continuing, as it's difficult as it may be, we must learn to speak calmly, yet passionately. Somerville's assertion that the biggest barrier to action is the lack of political will is both devastating and hopeful all at once. To know that we are so close to change, and yet to finding it so difficult to just get someone in power to care is so frustrating. Yet it only takes a small group of people with the power to create political changes. And this person continues, and then put 3 dots, I should have. Hold on. Oh, wait, this person did not continue. Yeah, so great comment. It is a very frustrating moment where we are in time, because why I say that is, having been in this space for quite a while, 20 years ago was frustrating because most Americans were not worrying about this issue, had not become mobilized. We had Al Gore as a politician interested in making change, but that was pretty much it. Now, so many people have been mobilized. There are politicians frustratingly trying to get into office. When they're in office, like AOC, she's frustratingly trying to get change out there. And the question is, how do you do that? But as this person notes, and I think the comment is just so right on, it's both devastating and hopeful all at once, because we're getting closer. And again, in the last 20 years, we're getting really close. And that's hopeful, but it's frustrating is that we're not close enough. But it does suggest that if the momentum continues and once we tip, then it can be huge. And I mentioned, people find, for example, the fact that we are living in this tribal, very binary community now. And that's frustrating. But again, if you look at the actual numbers, it's close. It's very close. If enough people, and again, this would be your generation, move the needle, it can change everything. So I can't help but agree with that. And I think that's, if anything, this is such a good comment because it underscores the need for communication. Because we're just talking now really about a few percentage points, few percent of the American public has to get moved over. We're not talking about huge swath of people. And, when we look at something like, and I mentioned again, 2020, primary, when Bernie Sanders ran, he took quite a few states, including the biggest state, which was California. So we're tantalizingly close to actually being able to make these changes, and and to be fair, so you don't feel, things are happening. And I mentioned, UCSB as a campus, we have now reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, that we're producing less than we were back in 1990. And it's amazing the kind of changes that are happening, and that's the encouraging part. But you're just not there yet. But let's be encouraged that we might be. I too found this chapter very similar to my lecture series. Ken says the best way to combat climate change is by communicating and educating people around us. I do. This is essential to what Somerville argues as well. I found that part where he mentions the metaphors to be useful in doing this, and we kind of talked about that already with talking about not climate scientists but the metaphor of doctors. Since scientists have their own jargon or way of talking, people have a hard time understanding what they mean. I felt confused because before, while reading scientific journals on topics, I thought I knew well. Somerville says that we must use metaphors to compare one thing to another and bring out hidden similarities. My favorite metaphor he used was that of a fever. When you have a fever, you go to the doctor because people are not listening, people are talking, they're moving, and we should listen to what this person says. When you have a fever, you go to the doctor because you don't assume that a fever is all that your body is sick with. Fevers usually indicate underlying illness or create their own health issues. He uses the same problem with our planet. Global warming is like our planet's fever, but the temperature is not all we are concerned with. Yeah, I think it's really terrific idea that Somerville has, and this person is latched on to, is to think about a communication strategy that involves something like a fever or anything that uses a metaphor to talk about the problem. So, is the planet sick? Is that what the issue is here? Well, yeah, but then it raises a question of how the planet got sick, what infected the planet, what's causing it. And sometimes metaphors may break down because of that, but also it throws attention on to human beings, of course, that caused it. So I think in general, and I'll end on this, but next time we have a longer lecture, so we'll go to the full time, but we'll finish in a minute. But I just think this comment is so good to think about communicating strategies and what works and what doesn't. And, I've given you examples, Somerville's given you example. You've seen examples. Somerville is actually doing what he's talking about by creating a metaphor of fever and all. So I'll leave you with that to think about. So left one. Yeah, so having taken this class in general, we're 8 weeks in. Do you think that you would attempt to convey the severity or importance of the climate crisis to someone? People might want to see what it is before you leave. Again, the top two answers sort of take the bulk of the class, definitely or probably, which is, I think, really encouraging.